Well, good morning. We're going to continue on with the faith of Abraham. We started last week, as you recall, talking about the background of the text we're going to really focus on today in Hebrews 11. We focused on the sort of the Genesis background passages to what happened, what's referred to in Hebrews 11. So we talked, of course, about who Abraham was, the background of him, and where he came from and that sort of thing, and how he became part of God's story. So what I was mentioning last week was that the context of Hebrews 11 about Abraham is three specific things. You know, Abraham's life covers a lot of the book of Genesis, and so he doesn't talk about everything, obviously, that he could talk about, but he focuses on three areas, three things where Abraham had believed what God had told him. And so the three areas were in Genesis chapter 12, when God orders Abraham, or calls Abram to leave his home and go to a land that he did not know. That was the first area, and that was the context of him receiving the Abrahamic covenant in Genesis chapter 12. It was right on the heels of God calling him to leave his home, to leave everything that he had built at that time, and go off to this land that he was going to promise to give him that he had never seen before. That was the first area where Abraham obeyed God, believed God, and trusted God, and did what God called him to do. Okay, the second one, I skipped one here, but in the slides. But the second one, of course, was where God had promised Abraham and Sarah that they were going to have a child in their old age, and initially they didn't believe him, but then God fulfilled his promise to him that he would have a son. But then the third area was this one, where when God does follow through and give them their son, Isaac, together, that God then tells him to offer Isaac as a sacrifice back to God. So these were the three areas that the author of Hebrews focuses on primarily to demonstrate the faith of Abraham. So we talked last week about the Genesis stories and accounts of what led up to those and what happened in those stories. So what we're going to do today then is go back to Hebrews 11, where the author of Hebrews comments and teaches on those three specific events in Abraham's life. So that's where we're going to focus today. In chapter 11, verse 8, by faith Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. So again, here he is referring back to what happened in Genesis 12:1, where God had called Abraham to leave his home and to take everything that he had, to leave the life that he had lived there, and go to this unknown place. Now, of course, this wasn't just a random call. There was a purpose to this. And again, the context of that was his receiving the covenant, where he would be promised that he would give him, his descendants, the land, and that's where he would make him a great nation. And so ultimately, through the Messiah who would come ultimately from that promise, this was part of God's plan of redemption. So he wasn't just calling Abraham to go to this place just because he wanted him to relocate. I mean, it wasn't just some random odd thing. There was a great purpose behind what God called Abraham to do. It was part of his plan of redemption of all of mankind. And it was going to be this avenue through which Abraham would receive the blessings that had been promised to him and the blessings that were promised to his descendants. So I mention that because I think we need to understand in our own lives when we sense that God has called us to do something. It isn't just some random thing God wants us to do just because he wants to see if we'll jump when he calls. it's always in the greater service of the greater purpose of God's plan. It's always, the reason is because God wants us to be in a certain place, or whether that's physical or whether that's spiritual, for us to be in a certain place so that He can use us in His plan, whether it is through blessing us personally or through what we do in our lives, or sometimes it may not even be about us. Sometimes we have to get out of our little self-centered world and remember that sometimes He calls us to a place not because it's about us, it's because of somebody else that He's going to put in our path, that He wants us to be there for them. So we need to think, about when we think about what we think God wants us to do, or what we know God wants us to do, is to think, in an eternal way, and in a big picture way, and in a God's purpose way. To remember why He calls us to do these things. It may not be about us. And then certainly that was the case with Abraham. Yes, Abraham received blessings through this, but most of it he did not see the fulfillment of. And that's kind of the second part of this verse. That Abraham obeyed and went even though he did not know where he was going. And that wasn't, and I think it's more than just he didn't know the directions because he didn't have a GPS. It was much more than that. I think it was also the whole idea he didn't know where he was even going spiritually, where he was going with this plan, God's plan that He had for him. It was all something that he didn't see most of it in his lifetime. I mean, obviously he saw some of it, but he didn't realize all of this in his lifetime. Certainly when you think about the long term, the whole nation of Israel and the kingdom, and then of course the Messiah, and then of course, the New Testament Gentile believers who would all come out of that, us. He did not realize all of that. So when it says he didn't know where he was going, I think the author of Hebrews means much more than just the road. It was the spiritual journey and the ultimate outcome of all of God's promises relating to the covenant that this was a part of. He did not see any of this, but yet he went. So, again, just like with Noah, he uses this term obedience, and he recognizes that, yes, Abraham obeyed what God told him, but he turns the idea of obedience on its head because it isn't about obedience in the sense of just following orders, though he certainly did. The reason that he did it was because he believed what God had told him. He trusted this thing that he couldn't see. But he trusted what God told him anyway and went out essentially blindly to this place he'd never seen. On this mission he could never possibly imagine everything that would go along with it. This great physical and spiritual journey to a place that was completely unknown to him. And to think about the things during this, if you read and study all of Abraham's life, we just skipped like a stone across the highlights last week, but you go through all of it, all of the challenges that he would face, that he and Sarah would face, all the decisions that he would have to make, all those decision points where he would have to say, do I go this way or do I go this way? And to be fair, all the times that he failed. He made the wrong decision several times. But yet that never took him all out of God's plan. I think that's one of the things that for me is encouraging, is even though there are times that he failed and didn't do what he really should have done, or didn't really trust God as much as he should have, God did not abandon him.
She's my sister.
God didn't say, oh well, I'm done with you. Never mind, Abraham, just go back to her. I'll find somebody else. He could have, but he never did. God stayed with him. And so Abraham couldn't possibly have imagined what, the journey that he and Sarah would go on. But yet, when God called him to do it, he did it by faith because he trusted God. Yes, he obeyed him, but it wasn't because he was obeying a rule or regulation. It's because he trusted the one who was giving him the call. He trusted God. He believed him. So, the word that is translated obey there, I wanted to point that out. It does mean to obey. It means, literally, it's a compound word that means to listen under. The idea that you're under someone, you're a subordinate to someone who's giving you an order, so you listen to them, to heed them. And it does mean this. But if you look at the root word, it's hupokuo, I think is how you pronounce that. The first part of it means the under, the other part means to listen, but that particular word means the idea of understanding what you're hearing. So in other words, it's not just a, you call, I jump. It's like you hear and understand. So it was like a knowing, reasoned obedience. In other words, he made a decision based on what he knew of God, that God was trustworthy. So he made an intelligent, thoughtful decision to follow the one who was trustworthy. So the other part of this, the word that's translated know, he obeyed and went even though he did not know where he was going. The word there means to comprehend and to put your mind to something. Excuse me. And then with a not in front of it. So the idea behind that word is that Abraham left home knowing that he could trust God, but not being able to comprehend what lay ahead. That's where the trust goes in.
Yeah, the King James says
So-
not knowing whether.
Right, not knowing. So when you trust someone when you don't know what's going to happen, that's real faith. To me, the analogy is this. The analogy is like a small child standing next to the 6-foot deep swimming pool, and your dad and you're standing there and say, "Trust me, son, jump." And yet it's water over his head. And then he jumps. Not because he really thinks he can swim, but because he trusts Dad will catch it. And hopefully Dad will.
What?
But that's the idea. You don't know what you are going to face. You don't know the depth of the water, You don't know whether you can swim. But you do know that Dad's there to catch you. And that's the idea here with Abraham. He didn't know where this journey was going to take him. He didn't know what challenges he was going to face. He didn't know where it was going to end up. But he knew who God was. So he obeyed, not because he knew where this was going to lead, but because he trusted the one who was calling him to do it. And that is the essence of faith. That's why the author of Hebrews, even though he's pointing out an area where Abraham obeyed, he is defining it as an example of faith, of trust. Because he set out on the journey. He jumped into the 6 foot deep. But he knew that God was the one calling him there. And that God was going to be the one that would guide him and fulfill his promises. So he trusted him. By faith, Abraham left his home and went to a place he couldn't see. So that's the first example. Well, this is actually a continuation. Verse 9. By faith, he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise, for he was looking forward to the city with foundations. That sounds like a song, doesn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Whose architect and builder is God. So his faith in God's promises enabled him to leave that comfortable home that he had made, make a new one in a place that was not his own, and in a place where he was an alien. This is another aspect of it. And I think this is another aspect of the faith and the trusting that God had for Abraham. the second part of it, it was not just that he was going to a land that he didn't know. He was going into a land where he was an alien, a land where he was a stranger, a land where other people were already there. And yet, it was promised to him and his descendants. When I read this, it made me think of Joshua chapter 1, when the Israelites did go into the promised land. And God told Joshua to tell them, I've given this land to you, even though, the Canaanites live there, and the walled cities are there, and the giants are there. Every step you take, it's yours. When you set foot in that land, every step you take, you are claiming the land. I've already given it to you, you just have to occupy it. You just have to take it. And I was thinking about that when I was reading this, about how Abraham went voluntarily, obediently by faith into this land, not only where he'd never seen, but he was the alien. He was the illegal alien, from their standpoint anyway. He was the illegal immigrant. And there were already people living there. But yet, it was promised to him as his descendants. So he went there knowing it was going to be his. Knowing that one day, his descendants, this was going to be their land, because God had promised. So he went there not because he believed he could take the land on his own, but because God had promised it to him. And he lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob. And I think this is pointing out the fact that when the temporary nature in the beginning, when they first went into the promised land, they didn't have big houses. They were living in tents, which means it's temporary, and they were nomadic. And they really, even though it was promised to them, they really didn't have a home there. This is one of those areas where the on-the-ground reality in the moment did not seem to match what God had promised. God had said, this is your land, but yet when they were there, they were the invaders. And when they were there, they didn't even have a place to live. They were having to live in tents and be nomads. And so their practical situation did not seem to match what God had promised. So Abraham could have said, well, enough of this. I'm out of here. I'm going back. But he didn't. He stayed there, and his descendants, Isaac and Jacob, stayed there because they were basing that not on what was happening today. They were basing it on what God was promising them and their descendants tomorrow. In fact, they had an eternal enough view that they were thinking more about their descendants occupying the land as opposed to them. Again, that's another, I think, a very important example for us. Because when God calls us to a mission, we don't always, in our lifetime, see the practical fulfillment of that. We may not live to see the fulfillment of it ourselves. We may be the stranger at a stranger. Well, we are, from the whole standpoint of this is not our home, heaven is our home. But even in the sense of what God calls us to do, we may not understand, we may not comprehend, we may not even see in our lifetime the ultimate outcome of it, because God may be using us as a piece of something that He's going to fulfill way after we're gone. We don't know. I mean, we all hope we live to see it, and we may live to see parts of it. But the promise that God made to Abraham was for generations beyond him. And so when they went into the land and they're the aliens and they don't even have a place to live, they nonetheless stayed there. Because they knew they were heirs of a promise. We talked about this a couple of chapters ago when we were talking about what it means to be the heir, to be the beneficiary of a will. And there's that, if you remember, we talked about that, like when somebody who is living makes a will and says, when I die, this is going to be yours. Well, in some legal sense, that thing is kind of in some legal sense already yours because you're the heir. It's like you can see it. It's like, yeah, that will one day be mine. But until that person dies, it isn't really yours. So it's like there's a promise that inheritance means there's a promise of something that will be yours in the future, but it's not yours yet in reality. Well, that's what he's talking about here. They're in this land, it's promised to them in the future, but right now it doesn't really, they don't have the deed to it yet. Like they're visiting, but they don't have the deed to it yet. They don't have the keys yet. It's their inheritance. And it's really the heirs, the future heirs, descendants of Abraham, who are actually going to occupy it. And we know historically that's exactly what happened. It was hundreds of years later before the Israelites would physically, in reality, own it in that real sense. So they had to look beyond their own lives. That's the thing that our generation, when I say our generation, I don't just mean the baby boomers, I mean really everybody that's alive today, I think. We just can't see beyond our own lives anymore, can we? I mean, there was a time, even in my lifetime, thinking about my parents' generation, my grandparents' generation, that they would think about their children and their grandchildren and the world that they were going to leave them. And I don't mean just in a physical sense, but in a spiritual sense and in a moral sense and all that. It's like it doesn't matter anymore in this world. It's like we only think about what will make us feel good today now, or what we want right now, or what's going to make me happy today, or what I want today, or what offends me today. So that I can get mad about it. It's like we are just so selfish and so self-centered. We have lost the capacity, I think, as a people, to think about the future generations anymore. I mean, it seems to me. I don't know. Maybe I'm being pessimistic, but it just seems like we've forgotten that.
I think back when our parents were raising us, they had big families.
Yeah.
And like,
That doesn't happen much
just
anymore.
look at us represented here. You have one son who has already said he's not having kids. We have one son who said he's not having kids. You have 3 sons who, haven't they all said they're not having kids?
No, my oldest, who
Oh,
is the only one married,
Yeah.
he doesn't want to have kids.
So it's like a different mindset almost. It's like back in like I said, when we were being raised, we had big families. I know you had one sister, but I had 6 sisters.
Well,
and
my mom was one of 5,
Yeah,
so I mean
yeah.
that was a fairly big family.
It was, and my mom was like.
And all of them
9.
had big families.
Yeah, and all my cousins, I mean, and I've got 2 sisters that had 6 kids, and it was just, that's what people did. They got married.
Well, your
and
mom
kids.
had like 500 grandkids.
Yeah, pretty much.
Well, and they all had big families, but part of that, and there were more than one reason for that, but part of it was just cultural, but a part of it was also, we saw that as the continuation of
Yeah,
our family, the continuation of our nation, the continuation of our people, continuation of our country. That was our legacy,
right.
was the families.
And that's just not the mindset this thing.
Because we don't care, we just want what we want today, that's all that matters. And you're right, I totally agree with you. I think that's part of it. And I think it's because we've become so self-centered.
My body.
There's no vision.
And yeah, there's no vision, you're right,
Lost the
exactly.
vision.
And so this is part of the faith that he's talking about with Abraham and Abraham's family, because he specifically mentions Isaac and Jacob too, who were in this land that they knew had been promised to them, but in a sort of a legal and physical sense, they didn't really own it yet because the Canaanites were there, and they were strangers, they were aliens, and they were living in tents. And they could have abandoned the call if they were only focused on what was going on for them. But they looked ahead, and they were thinking about the promise. They were thinking about, okay, our descendants are going to be the ones who are the recipients of this promise, not us. So we got to stay here, and we got to be faithful. And they trusted what God had told them. So that was an indication of the faith. And the reason, and that's, the next part of that verse, the word for, is telling you the explanation of why. For he, that is Abraham, was looking forward to the city with foundations whose architect and builder is God. So in other words, what he's saying there is that Abraham was not looking at the tents they were living in. See, it seems to be the contrast, They were living in tents. So, and they were living essentially in the wilderness. They didn't have a city of their own. They were just living out in the wilderness. Nomads. But what they were looking forward to, and that word they're looking forward to, it's that idea that you are expecting to receive something. When you're looking for something, you're expecting to receive something in the future. You're awaiting it, but you're expecting it. It's kind of similar to that, to the idea of hope, is that confident expectation. Well, they're looking for something because they're expecting to receive something. Well, what was their expectation? Well, they're living in tents, they don't have a city, they're nomads, but what they're expecting, because God's promised it, they're expecting a city. But it's not just a physical city. They had enough faith to know that it wasn't just that it was going to be a city made of stone and wood and stuff like that. It was something spiritual. And it wasn't something they were going to build. It was going to be a real physical nation, a kingdom. But it wasn't something they were going to build. It was going to be something that God built. Because God was the architect of it. Because if it was something Abraham and his descendants built, it would fail. But it was something God was going to build. It wasn't just going to be a physical nation, though it would be that. It was going to be a people he was building. Because the nation was not just houses and walls and castles. It's people. And it's not just physical people, but it's his people. It's a spiritual people. So it's a spiritual city, I think. That's what God's building. And that was yet to come. So they obeyed and lived in tents as nomads, as aliens, knowing that future city was going to be built by God, a people, a nation of God's called out people. And that's what they were looking for. And that's what they believed God for. So, I think that's where I'm going to leave it today. Because that's a good stopping point, because the next promise, we're going to skip. The next promise is starting in verse 11, and this is the promise of the Son. So that's a whole nother section, so I think we're going to stop here and pick up